It's a silver box, about really half the size of a shoebox in terms of width. It's the length of a shoebox, and it has lettering. Here's a taste of what it's like to make financial history. And in this box, which I purchased on eBay quite a few years ago, is simply a bottle of 7-Up, a 16 fluid ounce bottle in that familiar green bottle. And it's not as if it's a brand new bottle either. It's scruffy and obviously been refilled because it says return for deposit. And it's lying in a bed of velvet or a silk crib. And in the other inside cover, it says, on June 16th, 1978, Philip Morris Incorporated bought the 7-Up company for $520 million cash. It was one of the largest cash acquisitions in America, so it was no surprise that Philip Morris searched for the best and the brightest financial institution to handle the transfer of funds. Out of 15,155 banks, they chose us. And it goes on, and it's the United Virginia Bank, one of the leading banks in America. We hope this bottle of 7-Up serves to remind you that we're ready to provide any financial service when you need it. And the reason why I think this is such a great item, apart from looking pretty silly, is that in the early 1980s, I read a letter in the New York Times that supported Philip Morris in its efforts to oppose the Clean Indoor Air Act in New York City, one of the very earliest ones that was introduced, and a very mild one at that. Actually, it really didn't even mention Philip Morris, but what I realized when I saw that the letter was signed by the president of 7-Up, that nowhere did he mention that 7-Up had been a wholly acquired subsidiary of Philip Morris. And that's just perhaps one of the earliest examples of how the cigarette companies used the non-tobacco subsidiaries, a very benign, almost wholesome company with an age-old name, a distinguished name, 7-Up, to lend support to what really was a trend that was irreversible, but Philip Morris did every trick in the book to try to prevent any kind of clean indoor air legislation from being passed. And these acquisitions would go on, of course, to the major ones of Kraft and General Foods by Philip Morris in the mid-1980s, and also Nabisco by R.J. Reynolds in the largest acquisition at that time, I think, ever in American history. And, of course, what these acquisitions did was to insulate Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds in layers of sheep's clothing. And it also enabled them to remain as the largest advertisers on television. So even though John Stossel on ABC and a few others were beginning to do stories that were fairly hard-hitting aimed at counteracting cigarette advertisers and exposing them, Stossel did a great piece in the early, around 1985 on ABC's 2020, showing how their sponsorship of sports that were especially aimed at children, such as soccer, really were a great way to circumvent the direct advertising to kids that they had been no longer permitted to do. And I think that although Philip Morris has always been a slightly diversified company, they've owned real estate, and I believe they owned a razor blade company in the 50s and 60s, and if I'm not mistaken, even a surgical supply company. The fact is that the real use of these diverse manufacturers under the label of Philip Morris in the so-called Philip Morris family of companies insulated Philip Morris from a lot of the reactions that would have befallen them had they been solely a cigarette company. Ironically, today they're back to being just a cigarette company, but I think now they are on much firmer footing because they've basically assured through the various settlements that and bad bills like the FDA bill that they're going to be in the driver's seat for some time to come.